Isolation is something many of us crave. We call it getting away from it all. We pay hundreds of dollars for the privilege of being alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city and the prying eyes of society. But when you're truly isolated, you realize that alone is a relative term. Welcome to the final story in tonight's winter special on Mr. Horror World. If you've ever stayed in a rental home and felt like you were being watched, this story might make you think twice about your next vacation. Before we get into this final account, make sure you've liked the video and shared your own rental horror story in the comments. I read them all, and your story might just be the star of the next video. Now, let's head into the woods. Story 1. The Glass Door in the Blizzard. I've always been someone who enjoys my own company. Some people call it being a loner. I prefer the term self-sufficient. That was the main reason why, back in the winter of 2021, I decided to rent a small one-story ranch house on the outskirts of a town called Hart, Michigan. It was a remote area, surrounded by thick patches of pine trees and neighbors who lived far enough away that you'd never have to see them if you didn't want to. The house was dated, built sometime in the late 70s, but it had a certain charm. The best feature, at least I thought at the time, was a massive sliding glass door in the living room that looked out over the backyard and into a dense tree line. I worked as a freelance data analyst, which meant I spent 10 to 12 hours a day at my desk. Having that view of the woods made me feel less like I was trapped in a cubicle and more like I was part of the landscape. For the first few months, everything was perfect. But looking back now, there were signs. Small, easy-to-ignore things that my brain tried its best to rationalize. It started about 3 weeks after I moved in. I'm a creature of habit. I buy the same brand of granola bars, the same coffee, the same snacks. One morning, I reached into the pantry for a new box of Cliff Bars I'd bought just 2 days prior. The box was there, but it felt light. When I opened it, 4 of the 6 bars were gone. I live alone. I don't sleepwalk. My first thought wasn't intruder. It was, did I really eat 4 of these while working late last night? I felt a little annoyed at my own lack of self-control and moved on. A week later, I noticed a faint smell in the mudroom. It was a heavy, musky scent, like damp wool and unwashed skin. I checked the pipes, looked for mold, and even crawled under the porch with a flashlight, thinking a stray cat might have died there. I found nothing. The smell would linger for an hour and then vanish. I chalked it up to the old house smell my landlord had warned me about. Then, the blizzard of February 2021 hit. The local news was calling it a generational event. We were expected to get nearly 3 feet of snow in 48 hours, with wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour. Being from Michigan, I wasn't particularly scared, but I was prepared. I stocked up on water, made sure my laptop was charged, and checked my flashlight batteries. By Friday night, the world outside had turned into a chaotic white void. The wind was so loud it sounded like a freight train was permanently idling in my driveway. The power grid in rural Michigan is notoriously fickle, so to conserve heat and energy, I turned off all the lights in the house except for a small lamp in the kitchen. I sat on my sofa in the living room, the only light coming from the blue-white glow of my laptop screen. The sliding glass door was directly to my left. Normally, I'd keep the heavy thermal curtains closed to keep the cold out, but I liked watching the storm. There's something hypnotic about a blizzard, the way the snow doesn't just fall, but dances in violent horizontal streaks. Around 10:25 p.m., the wind died down for a brief moment. In that sudden, eerie silence, I heard a sound. Crunch. It was faint, but distinct, the sound of something heavy compressing the frozen crust of the snow. I looked out the glass door. The yard was illuminated slightly by the ambient light reflecting off the white ground, but beyond 10 feet, it was pure darkness. I saw nothing. I went back to my work, telling myself it was just a branch falling from one of the pines. But then, I saw it. I wasn't looking for it, but a movement caught the corner of my eye. I looked at the fresh, undisturbed snow about 15 feet from the glass door. As I watched, a deep, heavy indentation appeared in the snow. It was the shape of a large boot. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I stared, unmoving. A second later, another footprint appeared, 2 feet closer than the first. Then another. There was no one there. It was like an invisible man was walking towards my house. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the wind was carving out these shapes. No, these were too rhythmic, too deliberate. The snow was being compressed by weight. The footprints continued in a straight line, heading directly for the glass door. I felt a coldness wash over me that had nothing to do with the Michigan winter. I reached out and slowly closed my laptop, plunging the room into near total darkness. I didn't want to be a lit-up target. I sat there, heart hammering, eyes wide, staring at the spot where the next footprint should appear. The next one formed just 5 feet from the glass, and that's when the invisibility ended. As the figure stepped closer to the faint light spilling from the kitchen, he seemed to materialize out of the white haze of the storm. It wasn't a ghost. It was a man. He was tall, maybe 6'3", and incredibly thin. But the most jarring thing was his clothes, or lack thereof. In a sub-zero blizzard, this man was wearing nothing but a tattered, filth-stained gray t-shirt and a pair of oversized denim jeans that were soaked through to a dark navy blue. He had no coat, no hat, no gloves. His skin was a terrifying shade of translucent white, mapped with blue veins. He walked with a strange, jerky gait, like a marionette being pulled by unsteady strings. He didn't stop until he was standing directly on the other side of the glass. We were separated by nothing but a single pane of tempered glass. I couldn't see his eyes at first because his head was bowed, his long, matted hair shielding his face. I stayed as still as a statue, praying he couldn't see me in the dark living room. My phone was on the coffee table, just out of reach. I didn't dare move for it. Then, the man slowly lifted his head. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched so tight over his cheekbones that it looked like it might tear. His eyes were wide, frighteningly wide, and completely bloodshotted. He didn't look like he was searching for me. He looked like he already knew exactly where I was sitting. He raised a hand. His fingers were long and tinged with the purple gray of advanced frostbite. He pressed his palm flat against the glass. The sound was a dull, wet thwack. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it had been filled with sand. Then the man leaned forward. He pressed his face against the glass, right where his hand was. He opened his mouth and began to lick the glass. It wasn't a quick movement. It was slow, rhythmic, and animalistic. His tongue moved in wide circles, the warmth of his breath and saliva melting the frost that had built up on the exterior of the pane. Within seconds, he had cleared a circular porthole. He stopped licking and peered through the cleared circle. He began to scan the dark room, his eyes darting back and forth, until they locked on mine. He smiled. It wasn't a smile of greeting. It was a jagged, horrific expression that revealed teeth stained dark, almost black. He didn't try to break the glass. He didn't grab the handle. He just stood there, staring through the hole he'd made, watching me breathe. I realized then that if I didn't move now, I might never move again. I lunged for my phone, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I dialed 911 and scrambled back into the kitchen, keeping the wall between me and the sliding glass door. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the terror vibrating in my chest. There's a man, I hissed, my voice cracking. He's at my back door. He's staring at me. He's not wearing any clothes for the weather. Please, you need to send someone. Sir, I need you to stay calm. I'm dispatching officers to your location, but the weather is extremely hazardous. Response times are delayed. Is your door locked? Yes, I whispered, though I suddenly couldn't remember if I double-checked the deadbolt that morning. He's just standing there. He's licking the glass. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I understand. I want you to go to a room with a lock, stay on the line with me, and do not come out until the officers identify themselves. Do you have a weapon?" "A baseball bat," I said. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door and shoving my heavy oak dresser in front of it. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the aluminum bat, listening. In the silence of the house, I could hear the storm outside, but I could also hear something else, a faint, rhythmic scratching. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from the living room. It sounded like a fingernail on glass. He was still there. He was waiting for the glass to frost over again so he could clear it. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. The operator stayed on the line, her voice a thin tether to reality. She kept asking me questions to keep me focused, but all I could think about was that man's purple fingers and his black-toothed grin. Finally, I saw the flash of red and blue lights through my bedroom window, dampened by the thick snow. "The officers are on site," the operator said. "Stay where you are until they knock on your door." I heard the muffled sound of shouting outside, followed by the heavy thud of boots on my front porch. A loud knock echoed through the house. "Police, open up!" I pushed the dresser aside, unlocked my bedroom door, and ran to the front. 2 officers stood there, covered in snow, their flashlights cutting through the dark of my foyer. "Where is he?" the first officer asked, his hand hovering near his holster. "The back door," I pointed, "the sliding glass door." The officers moved through the house with practiced precision. I followed at a distance, my heart still racing. When they reached the living room, they shined their lights on the sliding glass door. The man was gone. There was nothing left but the circular patch of clear glass he'd licked clean, now starting to fog over again from the cold. The officers went outside, struggling through the waist-deep drifts. One of them followed the trail of footprints that led back toward the woods, but the wind was blowing so hard that the tracks were disappearing almost as fast as they could follow them. "We lost the trail," the officer said, coming back inside 5 minutes later, his face red from the cold. "In this visibility, he could be anywhere. But we did find something you should see." He led me toward the back of the house, but not toward the woods. He led me to my small wooden garden shed, a structure I hadn't opened since November. The padlock was missing. The officer pulled the door open and shined his light inside. My lawnmower and garden tools had been pushed into a pile in the center of the floor. In the far corner, tucked away from the draft of the door, was a nest. It was made of 3 of my old moving blankets I'd left in the garage, along with a pile of straw and a piece of discarded foam insulation. But it was what was around the nest that made me feel like I was going to vomit. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of empty food wrappers. I recognized them all. My Cliff Bars, the beef jerky I thought I'd misplaced, the specific brand of expensive crackers I only bought for special occasions. There were also several of my own spoons and a ceramic bowl I hadn't seen in weeks. "He's been here a while," the officer said, poking at a pile of clothes in the corner. "Looks like he's been using the shed as a base. He probably has a way of getting into your house while you're out, or maybe even while you're sleeping." I thought about the old house smell in the mudroom. I thought about the missing food I blamed on my own forgetfulness. He hadn't been a stranger who wandered out of the woods during the storm. He had been my neighbor for over a month. He had been watching me eat, watching me work, and watching me sleep. The night of the blizzard, the power must have been the only thing that changed. With the lights out and the world silenced by the snow, he didn't want to hide anymore. He wanted to be seen. The police searched the woods for hours, but they never found him. They theorized he might have been a transient with severe mental health issues, or perhaps someone who had been living off the grid in the national forest nearby. I didn't stay to find out. I packed a bag that night and stayed in the hotel in the city. 2 days later, I hired a moving company to clear out the house. I broke my lease and lost my security deposit, but I didn't care. I live in a high-rise apartment now, downtown. It has 24-hour security, 3 locks on the door, and most importantly, no sliding glass doors. But sometimes, on the nights when the wind howls between the skyscrapers and the frost begins to bloom on my windows, I find myself staring at the glass. I wait for a hand to press against it. I wait for a circle to be melted clear, and I wonder if he's still out there, standing in the snow, waiting for someone else to turn off the lights. If you found this story disturbing, hit the like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt like you weren't alone in your own home? I'd love to hear your stories. Maybe I'll feature one in the next video. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and hit the bell icon. I post new true horror stories every week, and you don't want to be left in the dark. Stay safe and always lock your doors. I'll see you in the next one. Story 2. The Red Light in the Snowbank. Winter has a way of making the world feel empty. When the snow is thick enough, it swallows sound, light, and, if you're not careful, peace. We like to think that we're safe in our cars, locked behind glass and steel, but on a desolate road at 2 in the morning, a car is just a cage. Welcome back to Mr. Horror World. Before we dive into tonight's account, take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're building a community of horror fans here, and your support helps me keep these stories coming. If this story gives you the chills, leave a like and tell me in the comments, what's the creepiest thing you've ever seen on a deserted road? Now, lock your doors, turn down the lights, and let's begin. Story 2. The Red Light in the Snowbank. This happened to me about 4 years ago, during the tail end of January. I was living in a rural part of upstate New York, working a job that I hated, warehouse management. It was a 40-minute commute each way, mostly through back roads that the county barely bothered to plow. On this particular night, I had stayed late to finish an inventory audit. By the time I punched out, it was nearly 1:30 a.m. A lake-effect snowstorm had moved in while I was inside, turning the world into a disorienting, swirling mess of white. The heater was blasting, the radio was off, and the only sound was the rhythmic thump-thump of my windshield wipers struggling to keep up. I was exhausted, my eyes were burning, and all I wanted was to be in my bed. I had been driving for about 20 minutes without seeing another soul. No headlights, no house lights, just black trees and white snow. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, maybe 50 yards out, a faint red glow was pulsing through the snow. As I got closer, I realized it was the taillights of a car. It wasn't in the middle of the road. It was tilted at a sharp angle, buried deep in a snowbank on the right-hand side. My first instinct was to keep driving. It's a cold thing to say, but at 2 a.m. in a blizzard, you have to look out for yourself. But as I passed the car, I saw the brake lights flare, bright, intense red. Someone was inside. Someone was stepping on the brakes, maybe trying to signal for help. I groaned, checked my rearview mirror, which showed nothing but blackness, and pulled over about 20 feet ahead of the crashed vehicle. I couldn't just leave them. In this temperature, if their heater failed, they'd be dead by morning. I grabbed my heavy-duty mag light from the glove box, pulled my hood up, and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. The snow was already up to my shins. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice sounding thin and weak against the wind. No answer. I started walking toward the car. It was an older model SUV, maybe a Ford Explorer, dark green or black. It had veered off the road and plowed nose first into a ditch. The back end was sticking up, and those red brake lights were still glowing, casting a demonic red tint over the surrounding snow. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The car was silent. No engine hum, no exhaust coming from the tailpipe. If the car was dead, why were the brake lights on? I reached the driver's side window. It was covered in a thick layer of frost and driven snow. I raised my flashlight and pressed it against the glass, trying to see inside. "Hello? Can you hear me?" I tapped on the glass with my knuckles. Nothing. I moved the flashlight beam to the passenger seat. Empty. The back seats? Empty. I felt a surge of confusion. I looked down at the floorboards of the driver's side, and that's when my blood turned to ice. There was a heavy red construction brick sitting on the floorboard. It was propped perfectly so that its weight was pressing the brake pedal all the way down. The engine was off. The ignition was empty. The lights were only on because that brick was holding the pedal down. My brain struggled to find a logical explanation. Maybe the driver went for help and set the brick there to keep the lights on as a marker.
but that didn't make sense. If they had a brick, why not use the hazard lights? And where would they go? There wasn't a house for 5 miles in either direction. I turned my flashlight toward the ground, looking for footprints leading away from the car. I expected to see a single set of footprints heading down the road. Instead, I saw dozens of them. The snow around the car wasn't fresh, it had been trampled. There were boot prints everywhere, coming out of the tree line, circling the car, and then leading back into the darkness. I stood there for a split second, the realization hitting me like a jump lead. This wasn't an accident. This was a lure. The red lights were a distress signal designed for a good person to stop their car and get out, and I had fallen for it. I turned around to sprint back to my Civic, but I stopped dead. Through the howling wind, I heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the rustling of trees. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the sound of multiple people running through deep snow, and it was coming from the woods directly to my left. I swung my flashlight beam toward the tree line. The light cut through the falling snow and caught the movement. 3 figures, maybe 4, were emerging from the pines. They weren't wearing bright winter gear. They were dressed in dark, heavy Carhartt-style jackets with hoods pulled low. They weren't calling out to me. They weren't asking for help. They were moving with a terrifying, silent coordination, spreading out to cut off my path back to my car. "Hey!" I screamed, the panic finally taking over. "Stay back! I have a gun!" I didn't have a gun. I had a flashlight and a set of car keys. They didn't stop. The one closest to me was maybe 15 feet away. In the white light of my mag light, I saw him reach into his waistband. He pulled out something long and heavy. It was a length of thick, rusted towing chain. He began to swing it in a slow, low circle, the metal clinking softly, a sound that shouldn't have been audible over the storm, but somehow I heard every link. I didn't wait for them to close the gap. I lunged toward my car. The snow was my enemy. Every step felt like I was running through wet concrete. I could hear them behind me now, the heavy, ragged breathing of men who were used to the cold. I reached my Civic and ripped the door open. I dived into the driver's seat, slamming the lock button down before my legs were even fully inside. Thud. Something heavy hit my passenger side window. I didn't look. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine groaned. Whir, whir, whir. "Come on, come on, come on," I sobbed, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped. The man with the chain was at my window now. He didn't try to break the glass immediately. He leaned his face against the window, just like the story you heard earlier, but he wasn't licking it. He was just looking at me. He had a look of pure, calm, predatory hunger. He raised the chain, ready to shatter the driver's side glass. The engine caught. The Honda roared to life. I didn't even put it in gear properly. I shoved the shifter into drive and floored it. The tires spun wildly on the ice, screaming as they looked for traction. The car fishtailed, the back end swinging out and clipping one of the men. I heard a grunt of pain, but I didn't care. The tires finally bit into the asphalt. I shot forward, the speedometer climbing. I didn't look back until I was a mile down the road. When I finally dared to glance at the rearview mirror, the red glow of the trap car was a tiny pinprick in the distance. But standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my own retreating taillights, were the 3 men. They weren't running after me anymore. They were just standing there, perfectly still in the center of the lane. The one in the middle was still holding the chain. He raised it high above his head in a sort of mocking wave. I drove until I hit the main highway, my heart rate refusing to slow down. I pulled into a 24-hour gas station, my hands shaking so much I couldn't even unbuckle my seatbelt for 5 minutes. I thought about calling the police. I really did. But what would I say? "Officer, I saw a car in a ditch with a brick on the pedal, and some men looked at me meanly." They hadn't actually stolen anything. They hadn't physically hurt me. In the eyes of the law, no crime had been committed. But I knew. I knew what would have happened if my car hadn't started. I knew what that chain was for. I never took Old State Route 14 again. I quit that job a month later. Now, whenever I'm driving at night and I see a car on the side of the road with its lights on, I don't stop. I don't slow down. I just lock my doors, stare straight ahead, and keep driving. Because in the winter, the most dangerous thing on the road isn't the ice. It's the people who know how to use it. Narrator. It's a terrifying thought, isn't it, that your own kindness, your own desire to help someone in need could be the very thing that leads you into a nightmare. If you're ever driving alone on a snowy night and you see those red lights in the distance, think twice before you step out of your car. You never know who's waiting in the trees. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video. It helps Mr. Horror World grow and reach more people who love the darker side of life. If you have a true story you want me to tell, send it to the email in the description. Be safe, be smart, and above all, stay alert. I'll see you in the next one. Story 3. The Guest in the Crawlspace. Intro. Visual, a slow zoom in on a snowy, isolated cabin at dusk. The sky is a bruised purple. Dark ambient music with a low, pulsing bass begins. Narrator. We live in a world that is constantly on. We are tethered to our phones, our jobs, and the endless noise of other people. Sometimes the weight of it all becomes too much, and we feel this primal urge to just disappear, to find a patch of earth where the Wi-Fi doesn't reach and the only neighbor you have is the wind. But there's a reason humans started living in cities. There's a reason we like streetlights and thin walls. Because when you are truly alone in the wilderness, you realize that you're not just escaping the world, you're leaving behind the safety of being watched by people who care about you. And sometimes you find out that you weren't as alone as you thought. This story was sent in by a viewer named Marcus. It took place in December of last year, and it's a chilling reminder that just because you can't see someone doesn't mean they're not looking at you. Part 1. The Retreat. By December of last year, I was a shell of a human being. I work as a freelance technical writer, which basically means I spend 10 hours a day translating computer speak into manual entries. It's soul-crushing work, and after a grueling 6-month project, I felt like my brain was short-circuiting. I needed a break. Not a sit on a beach in Florida break, but a hide from the sun and the grid break. I started browsing rental sites for something remote. I live in Minneapolis, so I figured I'd head north. I found a listing for a cabin near a town called Ely, right on the edge of the Boundary Waters. For those of you who don't know, the Boundary Waters is over 1 million acres of wilderness. It's beautiful, it's silent, and in the winter, it's deadly. The cabin was an old A-frame. In the photos, it looked like something off a Christmas card. Deep brown cedar wood, a massive stone chimney, and a lofted bedroom that looked out over a frozen lake. The price was what really sold me. It was listed for $60 a night. During the peak of the winter season, that was a steal. The description was brief. Rustic A-frame, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Perfect for artists and writers. Guests must be comfortable with isolation and wood-burning heat. I booked it for 7 nights. I packed my truck with a week's worth of groceries, several boxes of firewood, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read for years. I told my sister where I was going, but I made it clear, don't call me, I'm turning my phone off as soon as I hit the gravel. The drive up was uneventful until I passed Duluth. That's when the snow started. It wasn't a blizzard yet, but it was that thick, heavy Minnesota snow that turns the world into a grayscale photograph. By the time I reached the access road for the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the tree line. The road was more like a logging trail. My truck has four-wheel drive, but even then I felt the back end fishtailing as I pushed through the unplowed drifts. The cabin was tucked nearly half a mile back from the main road. When I finally rounded the last bend and saw it, I felt a wave of relief. It was beautiful. But even then, standing there in the fading light, something felt slightly off. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you feel like you just missed someone leaving? It was like that. The silence was too heavy. I brushed it off. I was just a city kid jumpy about the woods. I grabbed my bags, hiked through the knee-deep snow to the porch, and used the code the owner had messaged me to unlock the heavy oak door. The interior was cold, colder than the air outside. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something faintly sweet like rotting apples. I found the thermostat for the baseboard heaters and cranked it up, then went to work building a fire in the massive stone hearth. By 8 p.m., the cabin was warm. I had a bowl of soup, a glass of bourbon, and I was feeling pretty good about my decision. I moved up to the loft bedroom. It was a cozy space, the ceiling sloping down sharply on both sides to follow the roofline. Directly above the bed was a small iron-grated vent. I figured it was for heat circulation from the lower floor. I fell asleep to the sound of the fire crackling downstairs. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. Or at least it was until 3 a.m. Part 2. The sound and the ceiling. I woke up suddenly. You know that feeling when your internal alarm goes off because something in your environment has changed? The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cabin had grown quiet. But then, I heard it. Screech. 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 It was coming from directly above my head. In an A-frame, there's usually a small triangular crawl space at the very peak of the roof, above the ceiling of the loft. It's meant for insulation and airflow. The sound was heavy. It didn't sound like the frantic, light pitter-patter of a squirrel or a mouse. It sounded like something substantial was being dragged across the drywall of the ceiling. Thump. Something dropped. It sounded like the weight of a heavy book hitting the floor of the crawl space. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding against my ribs. I stared up at the iron vent above my bed. It was pitch black behind the slats. I reached for my flashlight on the nightstand and shined the beam up. The light hit the iron grate, casting long, flickering shadows across the sloped ceiling. Nothing moved. The sound had stopped the moment I turned on the light. Squirrels, I whispered to myself. Just big, fat winter squirrels. I lay back down, but I didn't turn off the light. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand until the sun began to peek over the frozen lake. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Old houses make noise. Wood expands and contracts in the cold. I was being a baby. The second day was spent exploring. I went for a long hike on snowshoes, taking in the brutal beauty of the woods. I saw deer tracks, rabbit tracks, and the occasional paw print of a coyote. But when I got back to the cabin around 4 p.m., I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The snow on the back porch had been disturbed. I had entered through the front door, and I hadn't gone out the back yet. But there, near the small maintenance hatch that led to the utility room, were a few scuffed marks. They weren't clear footprints. The wind had been blowing, but the snow was definitely packed down. I told myself it was probably a deer looking for salt or shelter. I went inside, locked both the front and back doors, and checked the windows. Everything was secure. That night, I decided to stay downstairs on the sofa. I told myself it was because it was warmer near the fireplace. But deep down, I knew it was because I didn't want to sleep under that vent. I fell asleep around 11 p.m. I dreamt of a gray face pressed against a glass, licking the glass. I woke up in a cold sweat, the fire having gone out again. The cabin was silent, too silent. I looked toward the kitchen. The moonlight was spilling through the windows, illuminating the hardwood floor. And that's when I saw the snow. Part 3. The Discovery. I got up, my legs feeling like lead. I walked into the kitchen. There, sitting on the floor, directly beneath a ceiling vent identical to the one in the loft, was a small, neat pile of snow. It wasn't a drift, it was a pile, about the size of a dinner plate. I looked up at the vent. The iron grate was slightly crooked. One side was hanging down by a fraction of an inch. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my fingers tingle. I grabbed a kitchen chair, placed it under the vent, and stood up. I'm 6 feet tall, so standing on the chair put my head just inches from the ceiling. I reached up and touched the grate. It was ice cold. I pushed on it. It didn't budge at first, but then, with a sickening clink, the entire grate swung open on a hinge I hadn't noticed before. I almost fell off the chair. I scrambled back, my heart hammering. I grabbed my flashlight from the counter and climbed back up. I shined the light into the dark hole in the ceiling. The first thing I saw was the insulation, pink fiberglass matted down. The second thing I saw was the smell. Up close, that sweet, rotting smell I'd noticed on the first day was overpowering. It smelled like garbage and unwashed skin. I panned the light to the left. The crawl space was larger than I thought. It ran the entire length of the cabin's peak. And there, about 10 feet away, was a nest. It was made of 3 of the decorative throw pillows from the living room, pillows I hadn't even realized were missing. There was a sleeping bag too, a high-end Sub-Zero bag that definitely didn't belong to the cabin. But it was what was next to the sleeping bag that made me stop breathing. A pair of boots. They were heavy, black work boots. They were sitting neatly on a piece of cardboard, and they were wet. There were small puddles of melted snow around them. Someone had just been wearing them. I panned the light further, my hand shaking so much the beam was dancing. I followed the crawl space toward the area directly above the loft bedroom where I had slept the first night. In the floorboards of the crawl space, right above where my pillow would be, a hole had been drilled. It was small, maybe the size of a quarter. Sitting directly over that hole was a small black device. It was a digital camera mounted on a flexible tripod. A tiny blue light on the side of the camera was blinking, recording. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the edge of the vent to keep from fainting. Someone had been lying inches above my head, filming me while I slept. And then I heard it. It wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the utility room at the back of the house, the maintenance hatch. The person wasn't in the crawl space anymore. They were in the house. I didn't think. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't grab my shoes. I jumped off the chair, grabbed my truck keys from the kitchen counter, and bolted for the front door. I ripped it open and flew down the porch steps. I was in my socks. The snow was up to my shins, and the cold was like 1,000 needles stabbing my skin. I didn't care. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers already starting to go numb. I got the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed the locks. I started the engine and turned on the headlights. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the front of the cabin. The front door was still open wide, a rectangle of yellow light against the black wood. And standing there, in the middle of the doorway, was a man. He was thin, gaunt almost. He was wearing a filthy flannel shirt and jeans that were torn at the knees. He wasn't wearing boots. He was in his stocking feet. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just stood there, framed in the light, and watched me. He held something up in his hand. It was my phone. I'd left it on the nightstand in the loft. He looked at the phone, then looked at me, and then he did something that still haunts my dreams. He waved. A slow, deliberate wave. I floored it. I didn't care about the drifts or the transmission. I drove that truck like a madman as the engine screamed as I plowed through the snow. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I drove until I saw the lights of a 24-hour gas station. I ran inside, still in my socks, and begged the clerk to call the police. Part 5. The Aftermath. The St. Louis County Sheriff's deputies went out to the cabin an hour later. They didn't find the man. By the time they arrived, he had vanished into the woods. Given the temperature and the depth of the snow, they said he wouldn't survive long without gear, unless he had another place to hide. They searched the cabin and the crawlspace. They found the camera. When they reviewed the footage, they found more than just clips of me. They found footage of the previous 3 renters, a young couple from Chicago, a solo hiker, an elderly man. All of them filmed in the dark. All of them watched while they slept. The caretaker, it turned out, was a local man named Elias. He had worked for the property management company years ago before being fired for unstable behavior. He knew the cabin's layout better than the owner did. He had been living in the crawlspace on and off for nearly 6 months. He knew exactly how to move without being heard. He knew where the blind spots were. He had been entering the cabin to steal food and water while the guests were out hiking. The owner was horrified. He gave me a full refund and even offered to pay for a hotel, but I just wanted to go home. The police never found Elias. Some think he wandered into the boundary waters and succumbed to the cold. Others think he's still out there, moving from cabin to cabin, living in the spaces that we forget to check. I don't go to the woods anymore. I don't book rustic rentals. I live in a modern apartment now. It has high ceilings, flat roofs, and no crawl spaces. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet and the wind is rattling the windows, I'll hear a sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. And I'll look up at the air conditioning vent in my bedroom, and I'll wonder, is the blue light blinking? It makes you wonder how many noises in your own house you've spent your life ignoring. Maybe it's just the wood settling. Maybe it's just a squirrel. Or maybe someone is just waiting for you to turn off the light. If this story gave you the chills, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Horror World. We have more true accounts of winter terror coming your way soon. Check your vents, lock your doors, and as always, stay safe out there. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.